in the Ag Economics department here at K-State. Some housekeeping items for the webinar. There will be opportunities to ask plenty of questions throughout the webinar. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat box and we will repeat them for the speakers. Established in 1998, our flexible hybrid program tailored to individuals working full-time in all areas of food, agriculture, and animal health has reached more than 500 students. We were the first distance degree program in the country focused on the business and economics involved in managing production, agriculture, food, and animal health companies. Not an MBA and not an MS in agricultural economics, we are a professional degree program aimed at training managers for peak performance in one of the most rapidly changing industries today. Our students come to us with a bachelor's degree, 2 years of professional experiences, and having completed some prerequisite coursework. The companies and agencies who employ our students indicate that the skills our graduates hone while in the program directly impact their teams, divisions, and companies in a positive way. With us today is Sara Trattles. Not with us is Dr. Keith Harris. However, he did help Sara with the project that she is presenting today. So we wanted to make sure we highlighted him as well. Starting with Sara Trattles is a VP of Commercial Lending at Greenstone Farm Credit Services. She works with large operations on the west side of Michigan, specializing in specialty crops such as blueberries, greenhouses, and cherries. Sara has worked for Greenstone for about 15 years in various positions. She received her bachelor's degree in agri-science, specializing in agribusiness management from Michigan State University, and a master's degree from Kansas State University through the MAB program. Sara and her husband have a farm in Colon, Michigan, where they grow corn, soybeans, hay, and seed corn. They have 2 daughters, Caitlin, age 10, and Taylor, age 9. Dr. Keith Harris used to be a professor in the Ag Economics department at K-State and has since moved on to a wonderful opportunity with the USDA. His new contact information is listed there in case you have any questions about his new role or about the project that Sara is presenting today. So with that, I will turn it over to Sara. Hello, Sara, and thanks for joining us today. I have an initial question to get us started here, and then I'll let you take it away. So give us an overview of your thesis project. I know that's what you're talking about today, which we recently turned into a white paper. So tell us about the topic and a brief synopsis of your findings and what we'll be discussing today.
So the title of my thesis was using historical data and sensitivity analysis to create future strategies, case for Southwest Michigan blueberries. And I came up with this topic based on the fact that at that point in time, my portfolio here at Greenstone had probably, I don't remember the exact number. I'm going to say 40 or 50% of the blueberries in the entire Greenstone portfolio. Being in Michigan, we have a very diverse agriculture, but it seems to be in pockets. So I had a lot of farmers in the blueberry industry. They were really struggling to find their stride at that point in time. And so I was spending a lot of time working with them. And it was just an opportunity for me to take a deeper dive into what was going on from a profitability standpoint. I wanted to find the break-even price for processed and fresh berries, because that's kind of the 2 segments that the majority, well, really, that's where blueberries go from Michigan. They either go into the processed market and end up in your yogurts and dried fruit. Even the frozen would be considered the processed division, or they're in the fresh produce section of your grocery store. So those 2 segments tend to be where the blueberries go, and I wanted to kind of look through what it costs to produce it, because the production is a little bit different, especially if you're hand picking the fresh blueberries, and go from there as far as what's realistic.
Sorry, I had to find my unmute button.
It's okay.
Okay, so with that, go a little further. How do blueberries really work? What does that season look like? I'm sure that there's plenty of us around here that are really focused on the staple grains in the world, so corn and soybeans and things like that. So educate us a little bit on what that looks like.
So blueberries are a perennial. It takes them about 4 to 8 years in the ground before they produce fruit, and 6 to 12 years before they're really a mature bush. So really, in all reality, it's at least year 6 before they're breaking even on just the yearly input. So they can last a long time. I have producers that have 30-year-old berries. I wouldn't say that they're the most productive, but if they're pruned and do nice, they definitely could get 20 years of good production, and be solid berries. A little bit of that depends on variety and that kind of thing, but they are, in Michigan, we have what they call high bush blueberries. In other parts of the country, they have low bush or some rabbit eye down in Florida and Georgia specifically. But up here we have the high bush berries. They are grown in rows and they're spaced when they're first planted about 4 feet apart. Some people use a little bit less spacing. Bees do a lot of the work for them, in the spring as they are in blossom. They have bees come out there, people that have apiaries. It's actually an expense for blueberry growers unless they have their own bees, but most don't. So the bees are set out there and they kind of do their work in the late spring when they're all in flower. And then that kind of sets them up for summer production. And depending varieties here in Michigan, our production starts the end of June or beginning of July, and it can be all the way through into September. So I was just out on a blueberry farm this morning and they just wrapped up a week ago. So that was definitely a later variety. Most people are wrapped up by the beginning of September, but quite a long season really for blueberries in comparison to some other specialty crops. They typically, yeah, and then they typically get several pickings off like a blueberry bush. A common variety here in Michigan would be a blue crop, and that's pretty common everywhere. And they'll usually get, I'd say, 3 or 4 pickings off that. So the way they ripen, they'll ripen and there'll be several blues. They'll send a crew out there if it's hand-picked, or if it's a machine picked, they'll send the machine through. If the machine goes through, it'll pull off everything that's anywhere near ripe, including some of the greens that are starting to become blue. So you can't pick them as much, but if they're hand picked and if labor is not an issue, then they can get more pickings off there. That being said, labor is definitely an issue, and it was in 2019 when I wrote this thesis, but then given everything that has happened with labor in this country since COVID has hit, I would say that's definitely one more dynamic that is shifting and changing. Probably would have changed anyway, but I think just the fact that everywhere I drive in Michigan, at least, they're hiring, it's definitely impacted agriculture and definitely the blueberry industry as well. So that is something that it was already shifting, but even more so, producers are trying to machine pick and get a machine that is gentler on the berries so they can still fresh pack it. Because what can happen when they are machine picked and fresh packed is you just get some squishies and things like that where it's just not as pretty. You're not going to want to buy that if it's, blueberry soup. You want a nice firm blueberry. And I think a lot of growers are breeding for that too. There's a lot of new varieties out there that have thicker skins and still have a good flavor. So that is kind of the goal, or the ideal berry today is one that has a thicker skin and can deal with a little bit of that. Weather also impacts that too. You can just have a really wet summer like this year, and there were some varieties that really struggled to have a nice berry this year that wasn't soft. So
Yeah, definitely. Before I let you show us or explain to us the ins and outs of the income and expense and sensitivity stuff from your thesis, You had mentioned that labor is one obstacle. Are there other obstacles that you're seeing in the blueberry world today? Or, is the industry growing? What does that look like so that we can kind of see some of that when we get into the models?
I wouldn't say that the industry is growing. I don't think, in what I've looked at, especially since I've done this thesis, I think the number of acres and blueberries in Michigan is less than it was. But given the research that I did and the growers that I've worked with, that's probably a good thing. There was an abundance of, particularly the Jersey crop, which is an old variety. It is nice for like you pick stand. That's probably its best used for that. People do enjoy the flavor of that, but it's not the best berry for larger scale production. That variety is very susceptible to diseases. A couple that have come into Michigan, and so that is an issue. That gull, wasp. The other thing that had happened, and I'm gonna say this probably happened around 2010, maybe a couple years before that, I don't recall right offhand, is the spotted wing Drosophila that really impacted how much they had to spray. Those bugs come in and they lay eggs, and then they are in the fruit, and nobody wants to eat that. So it has made their expenses when it comes to chemicals a lot higher. And I think that was one of the things that shifted the blueberry industry and gave the blueberry growers a few hard years, was adapting to that change, which they couldn't neglect. And then also the importing pressure, imports of both processed and fresh. And that has continued to evolve since I wrote this paper. I think when I wrote this paper, I talked a lot about the end of the season. Michigan really had an advantage. They used controlled atmosphere, or CA storage, quite a lot, where they put fresh blueberries that were nice and firm in a CA storage for 3 or 4 weeks. By that time, it would be like this time of year or into October, they would let them out, and they'd be on supermarket shelves and be fresh US berries. Well, what has happened is Peru has really came into the industry, and that was starting to happen. My actual paper talks a little bit about their curve, but that has continued to give pressure. And I will say from the last couple of years, producers are not putting anything into CA storage because it just didn't pay the amount you have to pay for that storage for a week or two. It's not doubling the price or tripling the price like it was, even 3 or 4 years ago. So that's been a shift in the way growers are managing their crop, so to speak. But definitely, I think that will continue to happen is the world economy is, the imports that we're seeing. Did I answer all your questions there, Jody?
Yeah, so far so good. You're
Great.
killing it. And if anybody has any questions throughout, really just throw them in the chat. And this is meant to be a discussion with Sara here, just because the models are dynamic. So that brings me to the next piece with the models that you created. Tell us more about those models you created for your thesis in this white paper, and how that can maybe be translated into something other than blueberries.
Okay, I am gonna attempt to do this. I'm gonna share a screen. So this was a part of my thesis and part of the white paper that Jody helped create to give kind of a little synopsis of what I did, basically. So this is just a typical income and expenses. This one happens to be for fresh berries, and this could be adapted for any industry. I mean, from row crops to an ag business or food systems. It's really just simple, kind of trying to identify what are variable expenses. And by variable, I mean, if you have more acres, it's going to be more expensive. Or if you have more pounds of production, it's going to change the price versus what are fixed expenses that you're going to have to pay, like insurance, for example. You pay insurance on the size of operation you are, and it doesn't change, 1 year to the next year, even if your production is half as much as it was the year before because you were crossed it out or something like that. So what I identified was, and in this, I believe I used the state average for the yield and then price. As I did my paper, I did some sensitivity to things like what would happen if chemical prices go up 10%, because in all reality, they're all variable. And I think we all understand that and know that. But I think as producers or as a manager or loan officer, anything like that, we kind of have an idea of the scope of what we're working on and where are the spots where there's the most sensitivity. Where's the spots that what we're projecting, because it's always kind of like well, this is what's typical, or this is what's realistic for this year in this given environment. I think from there we can go backwards. If you have a frost in the spring, and typically blueberries are pretty well protected in Michigan between a couple of things, wind machines or overhead irrigation that they can run if there's a late frost and the blueberries are already out there. But it can happen that they're frosted off, or, so that could really impact yield. And ideally, as a producer, hopefully you're doing better than the state average. So you would use what's your yield history? Maybe it's your 5-year average or your 10-year average. If you have young berries and they're like kind of coming into 6 or 7 years, what is your typical production on other berries that you have that are in mature status? Because up until that point, you're probably just building your production. So I think that's a management thing. You only know so much, but in that situation, you can kind of make decisions, especially if you were doing this by the farm, which if I was a producer of blueberries, I would probably be doing that. But I also studied agribusiness and would want to know those numbers going backwards. So I think this is something that producers could pick apart and kind of come up with, any ag commodity. I don't think the price is totally stable. In some commodities like corn and beans, you can forward contract, you can have hedges, you can have some crop insurance tools put in place. So you can kind of have, this is my base price, this is my bottom line. In the fruit and veggie industry, I don't think they're quite as fortunate to have those I don't want to say safety nets, but they don't have quite as many opportunities. They're more price takers than able to market their crop or even store it the way grains can. But that all can be figured into here too, if that's the industry that you're dealing with, is, those storage and things like that. How does that impact the bottom line? Does that pay for itself? Does that answer where you wanted me to go, Jody?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I know at some point in your thesis and white paper, you talk about identifying potential economies of scale and scope when you're doing your models. Can you talk more about what that means?
Well, I work with several different producers that are actually, I would say, vertically integrated in that they have their own processing facility. And that's probably the number one thing that comes to mind when you say that is, if you are, I think in a lot of my examples in here, it's like, if you had 50 acres of blueberries and you're producing it all as fresh berries, the reality is you probably need more than that to really make a living. And so economies of scale, yes, there's got to be a point where, I don't know if it's 100 acres, maybe ish, where you start to become more of scale to really make a living doing that. But I think also having your own processing, a fresh line, so that you can pack your own blueberries into like a clamshell, that means that you can control some of the sort outs of that. Because if you're taking them in a lug to a facility, they're going to do the sort outs. And every example I can have, people sort other people's produce harder than they sort their own. So they're going to sort out all the greens, all the stems, all the soft berries, but they're probably going to dial it in a little bit more because they don't want to take a hit on it, and it's not their product. I think when you have your own processing line, you can set that so it's an acceptable level. The consumer will be happy with the product, but you don't have as much shrink, as they would call it in the industry. So I think that helps. The same on the process line, but I think there's a little bit more money involved to have a processing line. And the way that they process berries, they do it in a 30-pound pack. And so just to have all of that, and then it goes into frozen storage, and usually you're buying that storage. There's a couple different storage availability of fresh fruits and vegetables in this greater southwest and west side of the state that are available, but then you pay a monthly fee if you're marketing that way. I think you have to be a certain size, and that's probably bigger than 100 acres if you're trying to negotiate and do these contracts with like Yoplait and like larger bakeries and things like that. I think you really have to be, you have to have a lot of capital out there in the industry, but I do think that there's some economies of scale when you get to that point and you're vertically integrated that you are impacting the market. So I don't have the perfect size for that, but it takes a lot of capital to get there. You're not just going to start out and go, yeah, I'm going to do a U-pick stand and then we're going to do all of this. It's going to take a few steps in between to get there.
Sure. So with that in mind and tapping into your financial background a little bit, regardless of the commodity, how can that economies of scale or scope be identified on paper? Like, how does one go about finding out what that is? And if you don't have a good idea, that's okay.
I was just going to say, that's a good question, or a loaded question. I think the way the industry is going, and I see this a lot with lending, is farms are either going big and they're finding their own efficiencies and ways to find that sweet spot. And sometimes it's just opportunity, and the right opportunity came to that farm at the right time when they had enough capital to invest in it, or availability of credit. Or the other big push is in niche, whatever you want to call it. I think if you can bring something of value, a lot of people, are interested in where their food's coming from, foodies. I have a lot of friends from my college days and across the country that are doing unique things at farm stands and connecting with customers. And I think that there's of value to that. You can go to the grocery store and buy sweet corn just about year round, but I think that there is a following of buying your sweet corn from Link Farms, or that's one of my friends, and I think she just delivered her last sweet corn for the year just a little bit ago today. So, or her last big wholesale order. So I think there is definitely, I don't have a solid answer for that. But I think you kind of need to pencil it out and see where your bottom line is and what consumers are willing to pay. And I think work backwards from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so for these, whether it's specialty crops or larger crops or whatever, when they do have that annual meeting with their financial representative, what's something that they should be bringing to them? So I see value in bringing these income and expense reports to them, but is it important to also show those sensitivities in there? I mean, do you have anything to show us for that, or what does that look like?
I think that is always good to have in the discussion points. I think the other thing, as a loan officer, that I always want to see is their balance sheet and how it compares to the year before. I think that especially in agriculture and farm operations, so many tax returns and profit and loss are so based on tax laws that farmers are inevitably doing prepays and trying to not pay Uncle Sam a dime if they can, or delay it as long as possible. So seeing that balance sheet and lining that up along with the tax return is very important for us to see a true picture of that farm operation and where we call it working capital, where if they have all those prepays at the end of the year, but maybe they didn't show much of a profit in 2020, for instance, but they had a lot of prepays, we can kind of decipher that stuff. So that's something, when farmers have that done before they come to meet with me, it helps a lot in the analysis and not going through that individually, and then verifying things too. The more they can have specific, the more it's realistic. So, or we can kind of tell sometimes people just put out numbers and that can be kind of annoying. I think most loan officers and credit analysts can kind of smell that out. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Sure. So to accurately show how to throw in some of those sensitivities or shocks or changes to the income and expense and other models, do we have one of those to show? I forget.
I don't, but I would say the other thing that would be great to bring is if you had your projection from the year before and you didn't hit it because something was a shock to the industry, I think bringing an explanation of what happened, whether that's production or price, or I think bringing information to that is always helpful for, trying to figure out, even if you exceeded your projection, I think that's really good information to bring too, because every year, I don't think I've ever had a producer exactly hit their projection. I think the goal is always that they exceed it, and then we, stop asking questions and don't worry, but it's always good to highlight what's going on. I think that gives the relationship another level of value of, there are just some people that I know that I've worked with for 10 years that I just know that their projection is going to be inherently a little conservative. They don't want to put too much out there and sign their name to that. Where I know that there are people that are the exact opposite and they're very optimistic, and that's a lot of fun to work with. But sometimes I think when the rubber hits the road and we look at that and look back at what we projected, it's a little disheartening. So we have to kind of, I guess, make our character assessment as lenders of where those people are. And so I think if you can bring your projection and your reasons why it didn't hit it, I think that helps the relationship quite a bit.
Okay. Do you have any other tips and tricks for your customers and crop producers to help them stay on track financially, not only with maybe what they should bring to that annual meeting with you outside of income and expense and balance sheet, but anything else that you can mention towards that?
I think it's always good to have long-term goals and to share them with your loan officer. I mean, I think that is good to be able to help so that when you are wanting new requests, it's kind of like, well, we've talked about this for a couple of years and I've been wanting to put this building up. I mean, things come up on the, faster than that. Sometimes just a great opportunity comes before a farmer or an agribusiness, and it just makes sense for them to hit that. But I think sharing your goals and having that depth of relationship with your loan officer helps quite a lot to be able to position yourself so when you are coming in and asking for something, it's not a shock. And especially if it's substantial, it's something that they can go, okay, yeah, this totally makes sense. You've been prepping for this and getting ready for this for quite a long time. So I think that always helps to build a relationship and to set you up as a borrower that's going to get a yes and not right now, you're not ready. So I think that's what I would suggest.
Sure. One other question before I stop asking questions and give everybody else a chance here. As I'm staring at the typical income and expense form that you have shown, you have a bundle of things listed for variable expenses and a bundle of things listed for fixed expenses. would you recommend those get line itemed out when you do these, or is it better to have it in clumps?
Yes, I would line item them out. I think for the purpose of my thesis, or maybe even for the white pages, they got bundled together, but I actually did have them all line itemed out based on research that I did with producers, with MSU Extension, and some of the specialists in the blueberry industry. And this was down to this is what it would cost per acre, which is, I think, a good model or a good way to look at things. But there's probably, I mean, producers might have data based on, their 80-acre blocks or, whatever. And then that just might be what makes sense to them. So I wouldn't say the way I did it necessarily has to be the way it's done, but I would segment that down to, I think in my paper, I actually talked about how much like the USHBC that is in the marketing, those are per pound cost that producers have to pay. They're very small. It's kind of like a checkoff type program that they have to pay. I know I had the exact amount that was taken per pound. Packing, there's probably a general number in there from one of my producers. So yes, I would, to answer your question or clarify, I would break it down for your individual expenses.
Okay, so that means in this particular case, we are looking at this particular farm losing roughly $384 per acre. Is that right?
I think.
Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes, $384 per acre based on this yield.
Okay, so given this in this particular snapshot, where would you turn to first to start figuring out how to make that positive? Do you have any go-tos?
I would start with, I use the average yield in this. And I think the average yield in Michigan, my white paper talks about this. I know my paper talks about this, is Michigan's average yield is drawn down by some of these really old bushes. And when a producer comes in and they tell me that they, what their production is, and they're not at state average, this takes it down to me of they're probably not going to be profitable. Or the other thing that I see quite often, and this is a fresh pack, I see it more with processed, is they don't spend as much money on fertilizer inevitably when they get to the point where they're not getting paid as much or their yields aren't, which is a never ending cycle in my opinion of that. I'm not a horticulturist, but I've taken enough science courses and been around agriculture long enough to know when you're not fertilizing and you're not taking care of the plants, your yield's not going to go up. So I would ask more questions in this situation if this was a borrower I was sitting across the table from. But the number one thing that I think they have the most control over is yield. And some of that might be limited to the bush's potential, but I also think bushes that are trimmed well, bushes that are, I guess trimming would be the biggest thing that they can do. Additional plantings or knowing the age of the plants, that would be something else that they that could change. That it could, if it's a 5-year-old bush and it's producing that, I wouldn't have as much trouble with that as if it's a bush that they have no intentions to change and it's been out there 20 years, unless there was some type of a weather incident that year and it's just a low year. So I think there's kind of some more levels of asking those questions. That's the thing that would stick out to me the most. Price, I don't think that they have that much control over. This year, I think most producers got paid more than that for fresh. I think the average price this year was probably like upwards of $2. The price does fluctuate every week, but typically when we're done with the season, we talk about, okay, how did the average end up for this year? And some of that is just the luck of how much did you produce on any given week and what was the price that week. But I would say this year, I'm more excited than I have been in a long time to see the final financials, because I think producers really did well. There was some spotty weather issues or some soft berries here and there, but I think the price more than made up for that, or I'm optimistic to think that. Sometimes I'm surprised after I see financials, but at this point in time, all I've had was interviews with producers. So when they finish up their numbers, it'll be interesting to see. But like I say, everything sounds optimistic. I'm excited about that. So even if in this year, this example here, I would expect that this would be break even if they hit a yield of 43.64.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, I should probably give everybody else an opportunity. What questions are out there in the world? I think you may have an opportunity to unmute, but chat is always great. We're watching that chat and can definitely chime in for you. So go ahead. Any questions? I'm sure people are furiously typing in the chat. I just have good faith that they are.
Right.
One other question while they are getting their questions prepped. On one of those lines that says management or opportunity cost, can you define that and what you mean by that in your income sheet? Sorry, you even took it off the screen.
Oh, I think I had that in as like a draw on them. So I had figured in that every producer is going to take some type of whether they take it as, paying themselves W-2, depending on what type of entity it is, or just family draw off that. And if not that, then they're probably working a day job and they're paying someone to manage it. So that is what my definition of that is. So
okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, basically your wage, your living expense. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good deal. I don't have a first question yet, but I have confidence that there will be one out there.
Gosh, I would expect some hecklers. All right, I'm going to call out John Laporte. How you doing?
Doing good, Sarah. How about yourself?
All right. How's your thesis, or are you done?
I'm not done yet. I'm still working on mine. I'm collecting the data currently. So spent a lot of time working on that. In terms of, I guess one question I could ask you is in terms of you touched on this a little bit. In terms of the blueberry industry, what are some of the forecasts that you're looking at in terms of where that's going in the next couple of years, where it kind of is today, kind of compared to what you're looking at before, to where maybe is today in the forward lookout on that?
Ooh, loaded question.
That's why you don't call on me.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I like it. I think 2021 will turn out pretty good, as I kind of alluded to. However, particularly processed, I think the distribution of so many channels and logistics of importing, so the ports have been so messed up. I think that has really inflated the processed price this year, and I don't think that that's something we can expect going forward. So I think 2021, at least processed price, is probably an anomaly and not something that producers should expect. And I don't even know, I was out with a producer today, and they're pretty well informed, and they said that they don't know what the final price is going to be on process, and sometimes they get paid later or in segments as the marketer is able to market them to the store shelves, because they go into cold storage and then they are still marketing them. I do know initially from some of my vertically integrated contacts that prices are probably a good 40 cents contracting higher and earlier than they have the last couple of years. So I would say it's probably safe to say there, the actual producer will probably get 30 or 40 cents more than they had before. Just my guess at it, my crystal ball of what I believe, but I don't think that that's stable. I don't think that that's going to happen long term. The only thing that makes me believe maybe it will is some of these countries are really like Peru is sending their stuff to China, and that could really impact things. I'd rather them send their processed berries. They're going to send fresh berries to the US. I don't think that's going to change. But if some of these countries that are producing a lot of berries start sending it to China or to Europe more, that could be good for the industry too. I just don't have a good feel. That part in my crystal ball is still really foggy.
Appreciate that. That's kind of the one of the things I've been trying to figure out as well. Real quick follow-up, because I do see there's a question in the chat. In terms of conversations you've had with producers with the higher prices, are they looking to capitalize on that to make any improvements? Do you see more people kind of holding on to that, maybe that additional working capital kind of have in reserve for later years? Is there any kind of sense of what producers are kind of doing with that right now?
I think that's mixed based on management decisions. I do think that what I would consider more innovative growers are tearing out the older varieties, the jerseys. I've had some producers that have kept them for a long time, and they've done some innovative. They've mowed them down, and then they'll come back pretty quick, like faster than like the 4-year replant. I have some people like that now they're like, no, we're going to tear them out. It's not worth it. They're so more susceptible to some diseases, and then they have a bigger woody stem, and it's harder to get the harvester across them and things like that. That's where I see more innovative people pulling those out, planting newer varieties, and waiting. So they're probably not doing that with all their capital, because there's that waiting game before it's really going to be profitable. So I think mixed reviews, but I do see more and more jerseys in particular coming out of the field. And I think, I'm always excited when somebody says that. All my research didn't give jerseys a good name in my mind. So I just don't think it's very profitable. And I have to be sensitive to the older people that love to go and pick blueberries, because I think they love that. They love to make pies with that and the old nostalgia of that, but it's just not economically viable.
Sarah, would you like me to read the chat, or can you see the chat?
You can go ahead and read it. That'd be fine.
Okay. How has the carbon neutral movement hit the blueberry industry? Are you seeing growers invest in tools to help achieve a carbon neutral footprint in the near future? Is there a demand for that yet?
I don't think there's a demand for that. Not something I've really had discussions with growers. There probably are some things that they're doing more in general that probably are more efficient, and so probably make their carbon footprint smaller. For instance, where it used to be pretty standard to have solid set irrigation and run irrigation overhead with like metal pipes is kind of what I mean by solid set, hooked up to either a well or a pond system or something like that. I think there's a lot more that are, when they're putting in new berries, they're putting in drip irrigation, and they can do some foliar feed. They can do things like that through that. They lose less water. They use less water. So I would say that that's probably the biggest trend. I had not, I guess, thought about it in that way. So of reducing or their carbon footprint, but I think it probably would. And that would be kind of what I'm thinking would be the biggest thing. The one thing that when they do that, they lose some frost protection. And in that case, then they usually, if they're not really close to Lake Michigan, which doesn't take very far off Lake Michigan to really need some wind fans to kind of help the the air movement that can give them say 2 to 5 degrees. I'm not sure if that's the exact number when there is frost into May and the berries are already out there and they need to really protect them. Does that answer your question, Ben?
Are there any other questions out there?
I'll go ahead and ask one. This is a fellow MSU person out of Southwest Michigan. I kind of a follow-up to Ben's question. Yeah, an organic movement. Have you seen any movement in the idea of organic interest among the growers, and does that provide any more price security, or is the market still small enough that it's too volatile for that level of security?
I have seen some, and I do work with a few producers that are at least experimenting with that. I don't have anybody that I'm working with that is totally organic, but I have some people that have specific varieties that they are trying in organic. I do think there is a price differentiation. Depends on the time too. I think other parts of the country produce more organic than Michigan does. So I think it's kind of a game of, there are times in the season, and when I'm talking about the season here, I would say the US season starts in, I'm going to say April, with the southern production, the Florida and the Georgia, and moves through to North Carolina, New Jersey, and Michigan kind of hit about the same time. I think New Jersey hits a little bit more, and then Michigan definitely hits when the Pacific Northwest is producing too. So there are some times in the season where the price could be double or triple for organic, but you lose some production. They don't tend to hit the same numbers. So I would say to be determined. This is something that I'll continue to watch, and I definitely think it's something that producers are definitely interested in hitting that sweet spot to get that extra price. I think there are some varieties that will do better, particularly in my opinion, earlier in the season. And part of the reason for that is if it's early in the season, what happens here in Michigan, and Mike, I don't know, your picture has blueberries in it, so you may be following this, the spotted wing Drosophila. They just won't have to spray. There aren't as many options, and they won't have to spray as long. For instance, like in Michigan, Elliott is a well-established variety that is later in the season. And so from the time the scouting shows that the SWD is out there, they are spraying them every 5 days or when it rains. And so I think if you can manage your cost on that, that will help too, because you wouldn't have, like, a later organic berry would require more spraying, if that makes sense.
Sarah, if you could go back and pick up where you left off, what would you be looking at next?
That's interesting question, because I have thought about that. Just as things have shifted and changed, I think one thing that I would take out of my paper would be the CA storage. I mean, that's not even, I don't even think that's a player. It's amazing how fast that came off, which that was, for the time I knew the industry before that, it was, I think I even had graphs on that, and I'm like, this is the sweet spot, and it's not anymore, and it's 2 years later. So I kind of have told people that have stumbled along to my paper, I'm like, yeah, you can read it, and you can, especially if you know the blueberry industry, you're like, well, You tell me, you can argue with me or tell me, but that it's crap. But I mean, things just change in the industry. Other than that, I would probably go back, and I have not done this research to see, has Michigan's number of acres changed? I suspect it has, just from what I know, but I haven't went out and looked at the USDA data, and that's always so, there's such a lag time too. MSU Extension would probably have better data or faster data than actually getting it from USDA, just because there's such a lag time. So I'm curious if that would have changed, and if the yield has changed at all. I don't know that that has changed much, would be my guess on that, but I think that would be kind of the next steps, or what I would think will happen in the next couple of years as these old 30-year-old bushes or older are being taken out. And unfortunately, some aren't being taken out, they're just abandoned. You'll drive around and see a field that used to be berries that are just weeds, and it's kind of sad. Does that sort of answer your question, Deborah? I feel like I didn't do a good job of that.
Yeah, and I do think that's really interesting too. I mean, I don't know if you saw the pictures of the almond trees that got ripped out, but then that's a water issue. But at some point, you have to make a decision that something's not going to be profitable again. And as much as we love them and they're beautiful, it's not going to work. So I think I was going to ask a question about that too, if you had seen some shifts in that direction, but you just answered it. So woohoo, way to get ahead.
All right, good.
Hi, Sarah. I had a question. You had mentioned worker shortages. What do you see happening in the future, as we're kind of, in this quote unquote great resignation time period, and with immigration challenges? How do you see that impacting the blueberry industry in Michigan?
That's a great question. I think H2A will become a bigger player. Historically, in this area in Southwest Michigan, there are fruit and vegetable producers that use H2A labor, but I will say, and this is kind of how producers have told me, and I agree with their thought process on this, especially a few years ago. H2A, it's more expensive, but I would say as H2A has come into this industry, or into this area, I should say, where it's gained in popularity, blueberries are an easier job. Picking blueberries or working a processing line is an easier job than, I'll say, picking zucchini, where you have a 5-gallon bucket and you're carrying a big old bucket. That's typically a guy's job. Not that a woman can't do it, but it's just a very upper body strength kind of thing, where I think a family, a 19-year-old, or I'll say a 16-year-old Hispanic guy, and his mom and his sister, and the whole family can be out there picking blueberries. And so I think it's attracted them more historically to blueberries, and they've been able to keep the labor if the farmer pays them decently, with a piece rate or whatever. I think as you shift to H2A, there is regionally that price is set as a minimum. In this area, I think this year it's like roughly $13, and every year it goes up at least 50 to 80 cents. I think that will be something blueberries will have to look at. Many of the producers I work with this year did not have the labor that they had hoped for. Some down 50, some down 20, it just kind of depends. And two schools of thought. One is, I don't think fresh picking is going to totally go away. I think you just get a better berry when somebody can pick it. And so they may buy less labor, and then the rest of their labor, they'll use a harvester. There are harvesters produced today that are a little softer on the fruit, the amount of time that they drop. Because what happens is the machine comes through and it kind of tickles the bush and the berries fall down. So if they aren't falling as hard or they're falling on like rubber mats and things like that, and probably simplifying the harvesters. But some of the newer harvesters have less of a drop and a drop onto something that isn't quite as solid as some of the older ones. That keeps that berry able to be in the fresh market better chance of that happening. And so I think they can eliminate some or automate some of the labor. And so I think that's the other way that producers will be going in that direction, because I don't see H2A being the perfect fix for everything, but I think that that will be something we'll hear blueberry farmers using more. They already, most of these guys, if they have labor, they already have the housing. There's a little bit more inspections and fees to get that set up. It's so much when producers have H2A, it's so contracted and done ahead of time. The disadvantage is you can't change or evolve what you're contracted to do. When these people come into the country, they have to be prescribed, and job descriptions have to be written exactly that way. So that's some of the disadvantages, but they can get the labor here and get a good crew. That'll probably be their next step.
Since money is so precious to these blueberry growers, when they are looking to invest in some sort of modernization tool, where's the trend as to where they're investing? Is it, immediately pulling out and replacing the variety? Is it upgrading the infield, equipment such as the irrigation? Is it new picking equipment, new spraying equipment, something else? Where are they spending that money?
I think variety and irrigation go hand in hand. Most of the people that are pulling out are upgrading their irrigation as they're doing that. So I think a lot of growers that I see, when they put in new plantings, they're putting in drip irrigation right along with that. Like, that is just part of the permanent plantings that are going on that. I'd say less or so the spray equipment. That doesn't seem to be something that comes up or there's been any big innovativeness in it. I've had a few people that have bought some sprayers that are, I don't know, more innovative, but it's not a big push for that. But harvesters would be maybe the next thing that they're really investing money in to get kind of that sweet spot of being able to pick it with a harvester and still fresh pack it. That can save, I think the price average, when I did my research, and I think it's maybe $1 now a pound that it's going to cost you to have it hand picked. Depends on, every producer pays a little bit less. That I think it's like 25 or 30 cents if a harvester can pick it and fresh pack it. So obviously that would help expenses.
I know we are reaching the top of the hour here, so I'm going to be the mean one that says we are going to start winding this down. However, Sarah, are you willing to field questions via email?
Sure.
If so, would you mind throwing that email address in the chat? I know I mentioned it in the PowerPoint presentation at the beginning, but this way you have the email at your fingertips here at the end. Also, I'm sure Sarah won't appreciate me saying that you can go out and read her thesis, but you can. So feel free to go out and read her thesis. And the white paper that we put together is finished and ready to go. I'll let Deborah handle disseminating that out for your reading pleasure as well. But with that, we would love to connect with you all through our social media channels if you haven't already. Our students and alumni are very active on our channels, so it is a great way to start meeting others who have done the MAB or to connect with fellow colleagues and students who are in the MAB with you. We would love to hear more about what drew your interest in the MAB program if you are new to us here today, and talk through how we might be a great fit for you. So you can visit our website at mab.ksu, or sorry, yeah, mab.ksu.edu. You can also email us from there and pick a time that might work for you for us to get together and chat. If you know that we are the program for you, start an application. You can sign up for and complete an advising appointment. We will then send you a code to waive your application fee. So with that, that brings us to the very end here. Reach out to us via phone, website, email, and we can work with you to get you more information. And as well, if you have more questions about the presentation today, feel free to reach out to Sarah or the MAB program, and we can get you connected with everything. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Sarah, for being here today and sharing all of your wonderful knowledge. And we'll see you guys for the next webinar next month.
That's a pretty sweet deal to get your application fee waived. I think I had to pay mine, didn't you, Jody?
I did too. Back in the day, we're just old, Sarah.
Right. Well, I'm just saying, for any of you that aren't in the program, that's a pretty sweet deal. I don't think it's, what was it, $20?
I don't remember. Either way, it's still
Maybe it was 50. I don't know. I guess it didn't stop me from going there. It's a great program.
Oh, shoot.
Thank you, Sarah.
No